The Crimson Isles can really be a tough place to visit when you don't have a massive amount of experience on Hypixel Skyblock. After all, the mobs have an absurd amount of HP compared to other areas of the game. Mini-bosses begin to get a lot more strategic and they're just a lot more difficult. And Blaze Slayer to the untrained eye is just on another level. And I think a lot of newer players just fail to understand exactly what you need in order to do Kuudra. I mean, realistically, the basic tiers are not really too intensive. Although I can understand why it seems daunting, as the Crimson Isles really does feel like the elitist corner of Skyblock, apart from M7. But at the end of the day, there's 5 tiers for a reason. So in this video, I'm going to be showing you guys what gear you need all the way from tier 1 all the way up to tier 5. This idea was suggested to me by a few people in my Discord server, and to be honest, I feel like it is probably a decent idea. I think I would have appreciated something like this when I first started playing the game. Or at least when the Crimson Isles first came out. Before we get into any of that, if you are planning on purchasing anything from the Hypixel store, make sure to use code NITROS, it gets yourself 5% off. Also, you should subscribe to the channel, it does help out a lot. And you should join the Discord server, it's linked in the description of this video. We offer slays and dungeon carries, so if you need carries, or want to carry and make some coins, make sure to join. So first of all, we're going to be talking about tier 1, basic Kuudra. Doesn't require you to have any reputation, you essentially just need to have done the storyline in the Crimson Isles, got to the end of it, and you can do basic tier Kuudra. First of all, it's important to note when you spawn into any Kuudra initially, all of them are in the same area. It's all the same layout. And I'm not going to be going over on this video so much as how to do Kuudra, I'll briefly explain, but it's more the gear that you need. But just to briefly explain how you do tier 1 and tier 2 Kuudra, it's as simple as spawning in, fishing up the crates, bringing them to the middle, building the ballista, shooting the arrow at the Kuudra, and that's it. Before you build the ballista, before you shoot the arrows, there'll be a few people that'll need to fire the orbs back into Kuudra that will need to go for the Bomberman perk. They don't have to, but it makes it a little bit quicker. That way you can get Kuudra a little bit lower before you fire the ballista, so you don't have to build it twice. Tier 1 and 2 Kuudra isn't really so much about the gear, it's just about knowing what to do and being able to survive. Now it depends if you're on a budget or not, and if you are on a budget, I would probably recommend, if you already have Storm Armor, just to use that. If you don't already have Storm Armor and you don't have many coins, I'd recommend just buying the cheapest Aurora set that you could possibly get. Buy some Wither Goggles from the dungeon shop, you could get a setup for like 6 mil, maybe 7. In terms of weaponry, you could maybe settle for something like a Midas Staff, although weaponry doesn't matter that much. Of course you're going to need to kill a few blights here and there, but the weapon is not really too important. And then probably just to home into that mage idea, I'd probably go for something like a sheep pet. You really don't need a crazy setup to do tier 1 Kuudra at all. Like I said, it's more about just getting the crits as quick as you can, building the ballista as quick as you can, and just getting it over with. Tier 1 Kuudra can be, I mean, it's relatively easy. It can be a little bit tedious sometimes. And then maybe just an orb in the middle, maybe even just a mana flux or an overflux or something like that. But you don't have to have that. If someone else in the party has it, then all good. To be honest, a lot of like how you do in tier 1 Kuudra is going to be more dependent on the rest of the people doing tier 1 Kuudra. Of course, if you're the person in the party that needs to basically carry everyone, then you're going to need slightly better gear. But I'd say on average, you don't really need great gear. Now, moving on to tier 2. For tier 2 Kuudra, you need 1000 reputation in any faction, meaning that you can either go for Barbarian, or of course you can go for Mage. Once you get that 1000 reputation, of course you'll unlock tier 2 Kuudra. Now, tier 2 Kuudra is literally exactly the same as tier 1 Kuudra, although the mobs are a little bit stronger, the crates take a tiny bit longer to fish up. Honestly, the difference between tier 1 and tier 2 Kuudra is really minimal. But literally everything else remains the same. The way you do it still remains the same. And to be honest, realistically, you don't need really any better gear to do tier 2 Kuudra than tier 1, if I'm being honest. Now, something that's I've got to say is, obviously, regardless of what setup you're using, if you use, I don't know, the cheapest Aurora setup you can find on the AH with Wither Goggles and Midas Staff and a sheep pet, and you have 300 magical power, you're going to be substantially weaker than someone with 1000. So if you don't have many coins and you have a cheap setup and you can't survive, then maybe it's more of a magical power issue than needing better gear. And in that case, I'd probably recommend that you need to invest into your talismans and accessories. But realistically, for tier 2 Kuudra, a cheap Aurora setup with the goggles, a sheep pet and a Midas Staff is just fine. Don't really need anything else, and to be honest, like I said before, maybe a Midas Staff is even too much. Thing is though, depending on the people that you're playing with, if you're just going into Party Finder, then people have a tendency just to kick people if they don't have great gear. I know that for a fact. So it might just be down to a little bit of persistence. Or if you have some friends to play with, then great. If you don't, then sure, join my Discord server. There's loads of people playing Skyblock every day. Maybe you'll find people to play with. Now, the reason why the gear requirement for Tier 1 and Tier 2 Kuudra is so similar is because the actual tiers of Kuudra, the actual floors, are very, very similar. There's not a huge amount of difference, other than Tier 2 being just slightly more difficult in terms of the mobs having slightly more health, crates taking slightly longer. Now, Tier 3 is where it really changes, because essentially there's an extra stage within Kuudra. Everything starts the same. You have to fish up 6 crates, bring them into the middle, build the ballista. Of course, like Tier 1 and Tier 2, you would fuel the ballista, and then you're able to shoot it, whereas most people aren't going to bother fueling the ballista in Tier 3 because it's way, way slower than what you're going to do instead. This is where classes within Kuudra really come into their own. So in a classic Kuudra setup, in a classic Kuudra sort of party, you'll have 3 people that will fish up the crates. All 4 people will pre the crates. What that means is before Kuudra actually spawns in, you're able to get the crates before the tentacles come up, and you're basically guaranteed a crate if you're lucky. Now, one person will usually go crowd control, meaning that once they've pre'd the crate, they will then kill all of the mobs around the outside and the middle so that people can get the crates without being interrupted. And one person will also actually need to stun Kuudra. So after you've built the ballista, there will be one person who will actually need to go into Kuudra, get swallowed by Kuudra, and stun Kuudra using a gemstone, gauntlet, or a drill, or something along those lines. While that's happening, the rest of the 3 players playing Kuudra, Kuudra usually spawns around here, so you usually stand around here, 3 of you, and you'll then shoot Kuudra, and it's on a hit phase. It's like a hits basis. So as many hits as you can possibly do to Kuudra and then kill it. So the damage you deal at that point is irrelevant, considering it's just based on hits. But like I said, I'm not going to explain that too much. It's just more about the gear that you need. But you have to sort of understand what you need to do in order to why you need some of the gear, if you know what I mean. So the same remains. You need an Aurora setup, and at this point you probably need to start looking into a somewhat of a decent Aurora setup. You could probably get away with using Storm and Wither goggles if you're in a party, just so you don't get kicked. I mean, if you're with friends then, and they can sort of just get you through the runs, you could probably make it. But realistically, you're going to need an Aurora setup, and a fairly decent one as well, because of course we all know Aurora at some point outscales Storms. And of course on Aurora you can put attributes, and you can't do that for Storm. Now, when we start looking at attribute combination, there's something what's called a god roll, and I'm sure you've probably heard of it before. Essentially, a god roll is just the best possible 2 attributes that roll on an item. And of course, the way that you actually obtain these on armor pieces is from Kuudra itself. For instance, for like a god roll Aurora piece, you're looking at about 200 to 250 mil per piece. And the god roll for Aurora is mana pool and mana regeneration. Mana pool gives you a ton of intelligence, and mana regeneration increases your mana regeneration, which is really useful. I'm not saying you need a god roll Aurora setup to do tier 3 Kuudra, because that's not true. But it would be very, very, very helpful, but it's very expensive. Of course, if you're crowd control, then a god roll Aurora setup would be way, way, way more useful, considering that you're going to be using a lot of mana. At that point, it probably is a good idea to go down this route. Otherwise, maybe just an Aurora set with mana pool on it, and you don't really need to care too much about the other attribute. As long as you upgrade the mana pool a decent amount, you'll probably be fine. Of course, you also want to upgrade the Aurora setup itself, probably to at least Burning, because that's kind of the area where it starts to become better than Storm. So I'd say go for a mana pool, Burning Aurora set. Once again, it's not mandatory because it depends on your party. Anyway, ideally you'll have a Hyperion too. I know that's probably not really very nice to hear for a lot of people. But realistically, this is sort of the tier where you're going to want a Hyperion. You don't need a Hyperion, but I mean, if you crowd control, you definitely need a Hyperion. But you don't, it's not a 1,000,000% essential, but you'd probably be best off with a Hyperion. You can absolutely stick with a sheep pet at this point. For this stage of Kuudra, the first stage, a G-Drag would be even better, but a sheep's just fine. Now, I said before you need good Aurora setup, and that's probably true. However, you could actually go for an alternative, and there's always alternatives to everything. So you know how I was saying before how God Roll on Aurora is 200 mil per piece, mana pool, mana regen. Well, actually, if you go for a God Roll Holo setup, you'll be paying a lot less coins, and the mana difference is not really massive at all. It's actually very, very small. As you can see, you've got something like Holo Boots, mana pool, mana regen for 8 million coins as opposed to 200 million. Leggings, 7.5 million coins. Upgrade these and they'll be almost just as good as Aurora. They won't be as good, but they'll be very, very close, and they're much cheaper. You'll go into lobbies and you probably will get kicked sometimes and people will get annoyed, but they just don't know. That's the simple fact. I know people will probably disagree and they'll say, oh, well, no, they're just trying to be cheap and all. They'll always find a reason to not like you for having this setup, for whatever reason, because Skyblock players are just like that. They'll probably be elitist and they'll probably actually be spitting on you through the screen, but forget about it. If you can get a cheap God Roll setup that's a fraction of the price, that's not really that much difference in terms of the mana that you receive, then why not go for it? Some people just think they know better, and honestly, it just is good. It just is. There's no two ways about it. Anyway, obviously there's another stage of Kuudra where it's basically the hits phase. One person will need a gemstone gauntlet or a drill to stun Kuudra, and then the rest of the players will need a terror set. Now, you don't need an expensive terror set. When I did tier 3 Kuudra and tier 4 Kuudra for that point, I just got the cheapest terror set I could possibly get on the AH. So that was the helmet, the chestplate, the full set. So it's going to cost you, what, at most 1 million coins. You will also need a Terminator. Now, so that's not exactly cheap. The reason why you need a Terminator is, like I said before, it's based on hits. And the Terminator shoots 3 arrows at once. And that's also the reason why you want to use Terror, to increase the arrows again. You don't need anything fancy on the Terminator, you just need the Terminator, because like I said, it's hits based, it doesn't matter how much damage you do. Arrows deal an additional 10% of damage, as poison reduce healing by 24% over 4 seconds. This really helps and speeds up the runs. You could also potentially use a Precursor Eye, but it's not essential, and once again, it is dependent on your party. So realistically, if 2 people are using toxic arrow poison and have a decent setup, then the other person doesn't really have to do much, because there's going to be one person stunning. You can quite easily do DPS, or you can quite easily do the hit phase for Kuudra with one person. They just use more toxic arrow poison. It's not ideal, but yeah, I'd say that's realistically the setup. Like I said, there's always going to be anomalies. I've had people, when I've been doing my tier 3 Kuudras, in my party with much less gear, much worse gear, but that just means that the other 3 people have to have better gear to make up for it. So, depends on the party a lot of the time, but I'd say that's probably the gear that you want to go for. I forgot to mention, at least one person in the run is probably going to want an Overflux as well. The Overflux is going to want to be placed at the start of the run, so that means that the person crowd controlling on CC is going to have better mana regeneration. And realistically, once that's run out, that same person is probably going to want to place it again and again, just so that the person crowd controlling always has enough mana to crowd control or kill the mobs. So that's tier 3 Kuudra. Now we go to tier 4 Kuudra. I don't think I mentioned, but tier 3 Kuudra needed 3000 rep and tier 4 needs 7000. Now, here's the thing. Tier 1 and Tier 2, very, very, very similar. The only difference between these 2 tiers is that the hot tier, like I said before, is slightly more difficult in terms of the time it takes to fish up crates and the health of the mobs. Tier 3 is different to Tier 2, but Tier 4 is not different to Tier 3. Tier 4 and Tier 3 Kuudra is exactly the same process. You go through the exact same process. Tier 4, once again, will have slightly higher health mobs, and the crates that you fish up will take slightly longer. That's the only difference, everything else is the same. So, if I'm being completely honest, you don't really need a different setup. It's the same setup. It's going to be slightly harder. So that may mean that the people doing hits phase on Kuudra might want to use maybe a little bit more toxic arrow poison. Honestly, there's nothing really that changes. Which is nice, because Tier 3 and Tier 4 Kuudra is really, really good for loot and making coins. Like, it's crazy good for money. And if you want to go for a cheap option, then I would just recommend going for the Holo God Roll, and then also Stunning, because that avoids you needing a Terminator. But that changes when it gets to tier 5. Now, tier 5 Kuudra requires you to spend a lot more coins on your setup. Infernal Kuudra requires you to have 12,000 reputation in either faction, which is... Sorry, it sounds like a lot of rep, but honestly, it's not going to take you a massive amount of time if you do all of your dailies. Now, tier 5 Kuudra is a slightly different process, but it all starts the same. The same thing happens. You fish up the crates, you build the ballista. One person gets swallowed, stuns Kuudra, there's a hits phase. You do the hits phase and Kuudra will get down to around about 20% HP. You can't get it any lower than that. Then everybody gets teleported down in the middle of this island that you're actually on here, and there's basically lava surrounding you, and Kuudra will appear on one of the 4 sides for a few seconds each time, and you basically just shoot Kuudra with a Terminator. This is based on damage, this isn't hits based, so the damage that you deal down here really does matter. So when you get teleported down, if you have a Ragnarok axe, you'll right click, use its ability, wait a few seconds for it to tick over, change to your Terminator, and then shoot Kuudra. You can also get players to mana dump, so one person does more damage. There's lots of strategy. When you're down there, they'll basically, I'll let you know, like when tentacles hit down and regular Kuudra, the floor changes colour, don't step on that because otherwise you'll get hit and maybe die. The floor basically changes colour, and if it goes to red, that means if you stood on that piece of, or that floor, that block, then you'll die, so you need to avoid that as well. But everything else is the same, other than the final phase. There is a little bit more to it, but that's just a brief explanation. Now, in terms of the gear, yeah, it gets a little bit more interesting. So, you're going to start off, you're going to need an Aurora set, you're going to realistically need for it to be at least burning 10 star, which is a lot of course, teeth and a lot of essence and so on. You don't need a god roll. You don't need it to be god roll. I've seen people do just fine without god roll. I'm not great at tier 5 Kuudra, but I've done probably about 30 runs at the moment. I'm looking to do more. But yeah, there's definitely people who do it without god roll Aurora. Ideally, you'd have it, but it's not completely and utterly essential. Mana pool with burning 10 star will probably do the trick. There's no two ways about it. Realistically, you're going to need a Hyperion, and then ideally you'd probably also have a G-Drag. When you get to this stage of the game, a G-Drag is just, you just want one. Honestly, they're so good as well, it's so worth it. Once again, I'd say at least one person needs an Overflux at minimum, even better maybe a Plasma Flux or an SOS Flare, but I'd say an Overflux will probably do you still just fine. Now, with you now needing actually to do a lot of damage to Kuudra itself and it not just being hits based, you're going to need a good Terra setup. And like I said before, with there being god rolls on Aurora, of course there's also god rolls on Terra, but it isn't so clear cut. Now, on the Terra armor that I use for Kuudra, it has Dominance 7, and I don't really bother too much about the second attribute, because Dominance realistically is going to make you deal a ton of damage. You're going to be at full health as well when you're actually dealing damage to Kuudra, because there's not really anything that damages you down there unless if you stood on the wrong block, which basically instantly kills you anyway. Now, a lot of people have started to use Lifeline on Terra, which means when you're under 20% of your maximum HP, your damage and defense is increased by whichever percentage. I mean, the percentage is based on the tier of the attribute. But of course, this means for you to benefit from this, you've got to be really low on HP. So, god rolls for Terra consist of things like Dominance Vitality, also Lifeline Mana Pool. There's a few different ones, but I'd say realistically the easiest one to use is just straight up Dominance, and then the second attribute isn't massively really that effective. Of course, I'm sure with the right technique you could get it down so that you can use another attribute way better than just me saying go for whatever you want. But it gets a lot more expensive. I'd say upgrade this as far as you can. Ideally burning 10 star again. You'll also need a Warden Helmet. Warden Helmet is a ridiculously good piece of kit in specific scenarios. So let's see what it does for us. It gives us 300 health, 100 defense. It halves your speed but grants you 20% base weapon damage for every 25 speed. So what this means is realistically the max speed that you can get with a Warden Helmet is 200. Which means that you can get an extra 160% base weapon damage, realistically, with a Warden Helmet, which is ridiculous. Of course, the speed can be an issue in certain scenarios, but in this stage of Kuudra, you don't really need to move that fast, so all is good. Once again, you're going to need Terminator, and not just any Terminator, you're going to need a pretty good Terminator, because obviously the damage is sort of dependent at this point. I'd recommend that you go for a Duplex 5 if you have the money to. Once again, Toxic Arrow Poison for the hits phase. You can go ahead and buy the cheapest Ragnarok axe that you can find, because all you're using it for is the right click ability when you're dealing damage to Kuudra. Begin a channel after not taking damage for 3 seconds, gain 1.5 times this weapon's strength for 10 seconds. Of course, if you still need somebody to stun at some point, so if you need to stun, you're going to need something to stun with, i.e. Gemstone Gauntlet or a drill. When dealing damage to Kuudra, it will be ideal if somebody could shoot Kuudra with the Last Breath. The Last Breath reduces the defense of your target by 10% of their max defense on hit, stacking up to 5 times. So if somebody shoots Kuudra with this, of course it's going to take damage much quicker. Of course, you're still going to need an orb, so it's going to be what, like an Overflux, Plasma Flux, an SOS Flare, which is probably relatively overkill. And then, realistically, you're going to need just a decent amount of magical power. I mean, you're going to need all of that gear, and I'd say some of it is more ideal than absolutely 100% needed. I mean, everyone's going to have a slightly different setup at the end of the day, but at the end of the day, a lot of your ability in the game in terms of being able to survive and do damage is just down to your magical power. So if you're still struggling, then maybe you need to increase it, like I said earlier with Tier 1 and Tier 2. I'd say for Tier 5 Kuudra, you probably need at least 1,000 magical power, maybe slightly less. Of course, having slightly more could make up for having slightly worse gear. Now, like I said, this isn't a guide in terms of what you need to do, so it's not a guide in terms of, once you've built the ballista, you must do this. You know, it's not that. If you want something like that, then please let me know. I probably need to brush up on a few things. But having done a decent amount of Kuudra, I feel like I've got a pretty good idea of what you need at what point for what tier. Maybe some things are a little bit off, considering I've always played in relatively decent parties, so maybe I'm underestimating some things. But hopefully, regardless of if everything is 100% perfect, hopefully it's helped to some extent, because I know a lot of people at early stages of the game get a little bit confused as to the whole Kuudra situation, and that's completely understandable. Anyway, if you did enjoy today's video, make sure you leave a like, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next one.